You've always been a burden to this family." That's what my brother said into the microphone at his own wedding, champagne glass raised, 250 guests watching, and he was smiling. "Hi, I'm Edward Francis, 44 years old, single dad and a carpenter running a small woodworking business in Savannah, Georgia. My son Leo is 11, bright, loyal, the kind of kid who still believes his father hung the moon, even when the rest of the world treats me like I'm invisible. I've learned to stay quiet, to swallow the jabs and the looks, to build things with my hands while my family tears me down with their words, especially my brother Charles, especially my mother. But that night, standing in a ballroom full of silk dresses and forced laughter, watching my son's face crumble as my brother called me worthless in front of everyone he wanted to impress, I finally hit the wall. What Charles didn't know, though, was that the woman standing beside him in white already knew who I really was, long before she ever met him, and she had a debt she intended to repay. Welcome to Quiet Justice. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, like nothing you do will ever be enough, don't skip this video. What happens next will show you that sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who end up regretting it. But only if you stay to see how this unfolds. Most mornings, I'm up before the sun touches the Spanish moss. There's something sacred about those first hours in the workshop. Just me, the hum of the dust collector, and the smell of fresh-cut oak mixing with whatever's left in the coffee pot from the night before. I built this place with my own hands 12 years ago, back when I still believed hard work was enough to earn respect. A small building on the edge of Savannah, nothing fancy, but it's mine. Every shelf, every tool rack, every scratch in the concrete floor tells a story I actually want to remember. When things get too heavy, I drive out to the old dock on the Savannah River. It's nothing special, weathered planks, rusted cleats, the smell of salt and mud. But the water moves slow out there, asking nothing, judging nothing. Some nights, it's the only place I can breathe. Leo finds me in the workshop most mornings, still half asleep, backpack dragging behind him like it weighs more than he does. "You didn't eat breakfast again," he says, sliding onto the stool by my workbench. "Coffee counts." "Coffee doesn't count, Dad." He's 11 now, bright, stubborn in all the right ways. Got his mother's eyes, and thank God, none of her instincts for running. When Sarah left 7 years ago, packed a bag while Leo was at preschool, and drove to her sister's place in Florida, people whispered that I'd never manage on my own, that a man couldn't raise a boy right without a woman in the house. My family blamed me, of course. Said I worked too much, didn't give her enough attention, drove her away with my obsession with the workshop. Truth is, she just didn't want this life, didn't want me, and eventually, she didn't want Leo either. But Leo turned out kinder than anyone in my bloodline has a right to be. That's not my doing, that's just him. I slide him half a granola bar from my pocket, and he grins like I handed him gold. We have our routine. I drive him to school in the truck that Margaret calls an embarrassment to the family name. I watch him disappear through the double doors, backpack bouncing. Then I come back here, to the sawdust and the silence, and I build things for people who never bothered to learn my name. I gave up volunteer firefighting after Sarah left. Couldn't manage the overnight shifts with a 4-year-old at home and no one to call for help. Sometimes I miss it, the purpose, the clarity, the feeling of being needed. but Leo needed me more. That's the life, quiet, small, mine. But before I tell you what happened next, I need something from you. If this story is hitting you somewhere deep, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, hit that like button right now. And I want to know, where are you watching us from? Drop your city in the comments below. I read every single one because, unlike my family, I actually see you. I actually care that you're here. So don't just lurk. Let me know you exist. The phone rang just after 10 that morning. I knew it was her before I even looked. Margaret has a way of making the phone sound angry. Edward. Not hello. Never hello. Charles is bringing his fiancée to dinner Friday. You will be there, 7 o'clock. Don't bring that truck. I closed my eyes. I have a commission due. This is family. Your little hobby can wait. She hung up before I could remind her that my little hobby paid for Leo's braces last year, while Charles was buying his third sports car. That evening, I told Leo about the dinner while we ate spaghetti at the kitchen table. He twirled his fork, thinking. What's she like? He asked. The fiancée? Don't know yet. Charles met her at some financial conference in Atlanta about 8 months ago, probably like the others. Leo was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up at me with those two old eyes and said, Maybe this one will be nice, Dad. I didn't have the heart to tell him that nice wasn't something that survived long in our family. But I didn't say no either. Margaret's house always smelled like fresh flowers and quiet disapproval. I parked the truck 2 streets over, not because she asked, but because I didn't want Leo to hear whatever she'd say about it. He walked beside me up the long driveway, his church shoes clicking on the pavement, his hand finding mine for just a second before we reached the door. Remember, I told him quietly, you don't have to talk if you don't want to. He nodded. He already knew. Charles answered the door in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. He looked at me the way you'd look at something stuck to the bottom of your shoe, then smiled, wide for Leo. There's my favorite nephew. I'm your only nephew, Leo said flatly. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Inside, Margaret was arranging appetizers on a silver tray, her movements precise, performative. She didn't hug me. She never did. Just looked me over once and said, You couldn't find an iron? Good to see you too, Mom. Charles poured himself a whiskey and leaned against the marble counter. Business still slow, Eddie. I passed your little shop the other day. Looked pretty dead. It's fine. You know, I could get you a real job. Entry level, sure, but it's better than playing with wood all day. Leo's jaw tightened beside me. I put a hand on his shoulder. Not worth it. Then she walked in. Grace Renier was nothing like the women Charles usually paraded through these dinners, the ones who laughed too loud at his jokes and pretended not to notice when he looked at other women. She was tall, composed, wearing a simple navy dress that didn't scream for attention. I knew she was a financial advisor from Atlanta, that she'd been staying at the Marriott downtown during the wedding preparations. Beyond that, Charles hadn't shared much. Her eyes swept the room and landed on Leo first. You must be Leo, she said, crossing to him and extending her hand like he was a colleague, not a child. I've heard you're an artist. What do you like to draw? Leo blinked, caught off guard by someone actually asking. Superheroes, mostly. Sometimes birds. Birds are harder than people think, she said seriously. The wings never look right. He smiled. A real one. Then she turned to me, and something shifted in her expression. Her hand paused mid-reach, and she stared at my face like she was flipping through a filing cabinet in her mind, searching for something. "Edward," she said slowly, "it's nice to meet you." "Likewise." She held my gaze a beat too long. I didn't understand it then. "Grace, darling, come see the seating chart," Margaret called from the dining room, her voice bright and sharp as a blade. "Edward can help himself. He knows where the kitchen is." Grace's eyes flicked to Margaret, then back to me. Something flickered there, recognition maybe, or the beginning of it. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. 2 weeks passed. I tried not to think about the way Grace had looked at me. Charles needed help with the venue walkthrough, or rather, Margaret volunteered me before I could find an excuse. So there I was on a Saturday afternoon, trailing behind the wedding planner at Whitfield Estate, a sprawling property just outside the city, with a historic chapel on one end and an elegant ballroom on the other. Charles talked loudly about the wine selection, while I pretended to care about floral arrangements and table linens. Grace had been quiet most of the day, polite but distant, her attention drifting somewhere I couldn't follow. I'd stepped outside to clear my head, wandering toward a small garden at the edge of the property. Magnolias, jasmine, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask anything of you. "Edward," I turned. Grace was standing at the garden entrance, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Can we talk for a minute?" Something in her voice made my chest tighten. "Sure." She walked toward me slowly, stopping a few feet away. For a long moment, she just looked at me, the same searching look from the dinner, but sharper now, like she'd finally found what she was looking for. "You're a firefighter," she said. "Aren't you? Or you were?" My blood ran cold. "Volunteer," I managed. "Years ago. Gave it up after my wife left." "How did you—" "7 years ago. Maple Street, right here in Savannah." Her voice wavered slightly. "There was a house fire. A boy was trapped on the 2nd floor, 15 years old. Smoke inhalation. Everyone thought he was gone." The memory hit me like a freight train, the flames crawling up the siding, the neighbors screaming that no one was left inside. But I'd seen the curtain move on the 2nd floor, just barely, just enough. I didn't think, I just ran. "You carried him out," Grace said, her eyes wet now. "You went back into that house when the roof was about to collapse, and you carried my brother out in your arms. Marcus. His name was Marcus. I remembered the weight of him, dead weight, limp, his face covered in soot. I remembered the paramedics taking him from me, the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking for hours afterward. He's alive because of you, Edward." I couldn't speak. Grace stepped closer, her voice breaking. "My family lived here then. We moved to Atlanta a few years later for my father's work. I was at the hospital every day that first week. I saw you in the hallway once, checking on him. You didn't know I was watching, but I never forgot your face." She wiped her eyes. "And your son, Leo, you brought him to visit, didn't you? A little boy, maybe 4 years old." The memory surfaced slowly, hazy with exhaustion and grief from those weeks. Sarah had just announced she was leaving. I wasn't sleeping. But Leo had seen Marcus on the news, the boy who almost died in the fire, and asked if we could bring him something to feel better. "He couldn't really read yet," I said quietly. But he sat with Marcus and looked at the pictures in comic books, pointed at the heroes, made up his own stories for them. Grace nodded, tears streaming now. Marcus was so scared, so angry at the world, but this tiny kid kept showing up with Spider-Man comics and made-up adventures. It gave him something to hold on to. She laughed softly. Marcus calls him his brave little buddy. He still does, even now. I felt something crack open in my chest, something I'd kept locked away for a long time. Grace wiped her eyes and looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Not Edward the burden, not Charles's embarrassing brother, just me. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you," she said quietly. "I recognized you at the dinner, but I wasn't certain until I saw you again. I couldn't believe you were his brother." Everything shifted. After that day in the garden, something changed. It started small. A text message the morning after the venue walkthrough. "Thank you for your help with the seating charts. You have a good eye for people." I stared at it for 10 minutes, trying to figure out if she'd sent it to the wrong number. Then the coffee. I was in the workshop, sanding down a custom bookshelf for a client who'd probably never say thank you when I heard a car pull up outside. I figured it was a delivery until I looked through the window and saw Grace stepping out of her sedan, 2 cups in her hands. "I didn't know what you liked," she said, handing me one, "so I guessed black, 1 sugar." "That's exactly right," she smiled. Lucky guess. She stayed for 20 minutes, asked about my work, about the wood I used, about how I learned the trade. No one had asked me those questions in years. I kept waiting for the catch, for her to mention Charles, or the wedding, or some errand Margaret had sent her to assign. But she just leaned against the workbench and listened like she had nowhere else to be. "Don't you need to get back to Atlanta?" I asked, finally. "I took a leave from work for the wedding preparations. I'm staying at the Marriott until after the honeymoon." She shrugged. "Plenty of time." It kept happening. A week later, she texted asking what Leo's favorite subject was. "Science," I told her. "He wants to be a marine biologist." The next time I saw her, she handed Leo a book about ocean ecosystems she'd picked up at a bookstore downtown. His face lit up like Christmas morning. I didn't understand it. Why did the bride care about us? Meanwhile, Charles grew colder. He stopped acknowledging me at family gatherings entirely, just looked through me like I was furniture. When Margaret called, it was only to assign tasks, pick up the napkin samples, drop off the deposit. Check. Confirm the florist. Grunt work. The kind of jobs you give to someone you don't trust with anything that matters. "Edward can handle it," she'd say, waving her hand. "He's not doing anything important anyway." But Grace always seemed to find me after. When Margaret snapped at me for bringing the wrong shade of ivory ribbon, Grace appeared at my elbow 5 minutes later with a quiet, "She's wrong, you know. That shade is perfect." When Charles made a joke at dinner about my little woodworking phase, Grace changed the subject so smoothly that no one noticed, except me. She was undoing them. Stitch by stitch, she was unraveling the damage they left behind, replacing it with something I didn't have a name for yet. Real quick, if you're still watching, you're part of something here. But YouTube's algorithm doesn't care about silent supporters. It only rewards action. So if this story matters to you, if you want me to keep telling stories about people like us, the overlooked, the underestimated, then subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell, because I pour my heart into every single video, and the only way I know you care is if you show me. Don't let me wonder if anyone's actually listening. One night, Leo and I were eating takeout on the porch, watching the fireflies blink over the backyard. He'd been quiet all evening, turning something over in his head the way he did when a question was too big to ask easily. Finally, he set down his fork. "Dad?" "Yeah, buddy?" "Why is she so nice to us?" I didn't have an answer, not one that made sense anyway. Grace was marrying Charles. She was about to become part of a family that had spent decades making me feel like an inconvenience. By all logic, she should have fallen in line by now, learned to look through me the way the rest of them did. But she hadn't. "I don't know," I admitted. Leo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think she sees you, Dad, like really sees you." I watched the fireflies rise and fall in the dark, and I wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was right. The text came on a Tuesday afternoon. "Can you meet me tomorrow? There's something I want to ask you, somewhere away from the family." I read it 3 times, trying to decode what something meant. Grace had been kind to me, kinder than anyone in that family had been in years, but kindness didn't explain why she wanted to meet in secret. I typed back a simple "sure" and spent the rest of the night convincing myself it was nothing. She picked a cafe on the other side of town, small, quiet, the kind of place where nobody from Margaret's social circle would ever set foot. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting in a corner booth with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. "Thank you for coming," she said as I slid into the seat across from her. "You're being mysterious. Hard to say no to that." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Something was weighing on her. "I have a favor to ask," she said slowly, "and I need you to hear me out before you say no." "Okay." She took a breath. "I want you to do a reading at the ceremony, a scripture passage during the service. I've already picked the text, 1 Corinthians, the one about love being patient and kind." I stared at her. "You want me to read at the wedding?" "Yes, Charles's wedding." "Our wedding," she corrected gently. "And yes." I leaned back, trying to process. "Grace, Charles has a dozen college friends who'd kill for that spot. His old fraternity brothers, his business partners, people he actually likes. Why would you want me?" "Because I don't want them." Her voice was steady, but there was something fierce underneath it. "I want someone who means something, someone real." "Charles will be furious." "I know." "Margaret will have a stroke." "Probably." I shook my head, laughing even though nothing was funny. "You're marrying into this family, Grace. You know what they're like. Why would you start a war over a reading?" She set down her tea and looked at me. Really looked at me, the way she had in the garden, the way she did every time she saw past the version of me my family had created. "Because I'm marrying into this family," she said quietly, "and I want to know there's someone in it worth believing in." The words hit me somewhere deep, somewhere I didn't let people reach. I told her I'd think about it. She nodded like she'd expected that, and we finished our drinks in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy with everything we weren't saying. That night, Charles called. I let it ring twice before answering. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was ice. "Grace told me about the reading. You think I'm going to let you stand up there and embarrass me in front of everyone I know?" I didn't answer. He hung up before I could. 20 minutes later, Margaret's voicemail. "Edward, I don't know what you said to manipulate that poor girl, but you will decline this invitation. Don't you dare embarrass us." I sat in the dark living room for a long time after that, phone in my hand, their voices rattling around in my skull. That's where Leo found me. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down next to me on the couch and waited. Finally, he spoke. "You should do it, Dad." "Leo, she asked you. Out of everyone, she asked you." He looked up at me, his eyes too wise for 11. "That matters." I pulled him close and held on tight. He was right. It mattered. 3 days before the wedding, Charles stopped speaking to me entirely. Not in the usual way, the dismissive grunts, the eye rolls, the thinly veiled insults disguised as jokes. This was different. Total silence. He looked through me like I'd stopped existing, like acknowledging my presence would cost him something he wasn't willing to pay. Margaret, of course, picked up the slack. "I hope you're practicing that reading," she said at a final walkthrough of Whitfield Estate, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "We wouldn't want you stumbling over your little moment at the altar. People will be watching, Edward. Important people." "I'll manage." "Will you?" She straightened a centerpiece that didn't need straightening. "Because if you embarrass this family in front of 250 guests, I will never forgive you. Neither will Charles." I didn't bother pointing out that Charles hadn't forgiven me for being born. But Grace kept finding reasons to be near. She showed up at the workshop twice that week, once to discuss the reading, which turned into an hour of conversation about everything except the reading. The second time, she brought sandwiches from a deli downtown and stayed through lunch, asking about Leo's latest drawings, laughing at stories about his obsession with sea creatures. "He drew a giant squid fighting a submarine last week," I told her. "Said it was based on a true story." "Was it?" "According to him, everything's based on a true story." She laughed, really laughed, and I felt something dangerous stir in my chest, something I had no right to feel. That evening, Leo and I were washing dishes when he asked the question I'd been dreading. "Dad?" He handed me a wet plate, not meeting my eyes. "Is Grace going to be my aunt?" I froze, the plate slippery in my hands. "She's marrying Uncle Charles," I said carefully. "So, technically, yes? But she doesn't act like she's marrying him." Leo frowned at the soapy water. "She acts like, I don't know, like she belongs with us instead." I didn't have an answer for that. I didn't have an answer for any of it. Something was building between Grace and me, something unspoken, something neither of us had acknowledged out loud. It lived in the spaces between words, in the way her hand brushed mine when she passed me a coffee cup, in the way she held my gaze a beat too long before looking away. I told myself it was gratitude. I told myself it was just kindness, just decency, just the natural warmth of a good person trapped in a cold family. But I knew better, and I think she did too. Grace looked at Charles differently now. I'd noticed it at the last dinner, the way her smile didn't reach her eyes when he spoke, the way she flinched almost imperceptibly when he touched her arm, like she was seeing him clearly for the first time, and what she saw wasn't what she'd signed up for. Charles had noticed, too. I caught him watching her at the rehearsal dinner, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking between Grace and me, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't like the answer to. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The suspicion was written all over his face. The air in that family had always been thick with tension, but this was different. This felt like the pressure before a storm breaks, heavy, electric, inevitable. Something was coming. I just didn't know yet that I'd be standing in the middle of it when it hit. The chapel at Whitfield Estate was beautiful. I'll give them that. White flowers cascading from every pew, a string quartet playing something soft and classical in the corner, 250 guests in their finest, filling the historic space that had seen a century of weddings, none of them probably as expensive as this one. I stood at the lectern when my moment came, the scripture printed on a card I didn't need. I'd memorized every word. My voice came out steady, calm, stronger than I expected. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. From the front pew, Leo beamed at me like I was accepting an award. His smile was the only thing I focused on, the anchor that kept my hands from shaking. When I finished, I looked up. Grace caught my eye from where she stood at the altar, radiant in white, and mouthed two words, "Thank you." Charles's jaw tightened beside her, but he said nothing. The ceremony continued. Vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and the chapel erupted in applause. I clapped along with everyone else, trying to ignore the hollow ache in my chest. Then came the reception. The ballroom on the other end of the estate was even more extravagant than the chapel. Crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, a live band playing jazz standards while guests mingled with champagne flutes in hand. I found a table near the back, Leo beside me, both of us trying to stay invisible. The toasts began. Friends of Charles, colleagues, a tearful aunt who'd known him since childhood. Each one painted him as generous, brilliant, destined for greatness. I watched Grace smile through all of it, her expression polished and unreadable. Then Charles took the microphone. He started charming, self-deprecating jokes, grateful acknowledgments, the kind of rehearsed warmth that played well to a crowd. People laughed in all the right places. Margaret dabbed at her eyes like she was watching a coronation. Then his gaze found me. And, of course, he said, his smile shifting into something sharper, we have to acknowledge my brother Edward. The room turned. 250 faces looked at me. You've always been a burden to this family. Charles chuckled, swirling his champagne. Single dad, struggling business, couldn't even keep a wife, still driving that same old truck. But hey, at least he showed up today, right? Even managed to read a few sentences without embarrassing us too badly. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Polite, uncertain, but laughter all the same. Beside me, Leo's face crumbled, his chin trembled, his eyes went glassy with tears he was fighting not to shed. Something inside me snapped. I pushed back my chair and stood, every eye in the room now fixed on me. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't sit there for one more second, couldn't let my son watch me be torn apart in front of... Wait! A chair scraped at the head table. Grace was standing. The room went still. Grace walked toward Charles with a calm that didn't match the fire in her eyes. She reached him, held out her hand, and waited. He stared at her, confused. The microphone still raised like a weapon he didn't know how to lower. "Grace, what are you—" "Give me the microphone, Charles." It wasn't a request. Something in her voice made him obey. He handed it over, his smile faltering, uncertainty flickering across his face for the first time all evening. Grace turned to face the crowd. 250 guests in silk and diamonds, champagne glasses, frozen mid-sip, every eye locked on the bride in white standing alone at the head of the room. I need to say something. Her voice was clear, steady, the voice of someone who had made a decision and wasn't going to unmake it. 7 years ago, there was a house fire on Maple Street right here in Savannah. a bad one. My younger brother Marcus was 15. He was trapped on the second floor, smoke filling his lungs, and everyone thought he was already gone. She paused. The silence was absolute. But one man didn't give up, a volunteer firefighter who had no obligation to risk his life, who had every reason to stay outside where it was safe. He ran into that burning house when the roof was about to collapse. He carried my brother out in his arms. I couldn't breathe. Grace turned and looked directly at me. "That man," she said, pointing, "is Edward Francis. He saved my brother's life, and he never told anyone, never asked for recognition, never expected anything in return." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads swiveled toward me. I felt Leo's hand find mine under the table, gripping tight. Grace wasn't finished. And his son, Leo, was just 4 years old at the time. Too young to read, really. But Edward brought him to the hospital to visit Marcus. And that little boy sat by my brother's bed for weeks, looked at comic books with him, made up stories about the superheroes in the pictures, made Marcus laugh when he wanted to give up. Her voice cracked slightly. "Marcus calls him his brave little buddy. He still does." Leo made a small sound beside me. I squeezed his hand harder. Grace turned back to Charles. Her expression had changed, hardened into something cold and final. "You just called that man a burden, in front of everyone he's ever known, in front of his son." She shook her head slowly. "The man who saved my brother's life, the boy who helped him heal." Charles's face had gone pale. "Grace, I didn't know." "You didn't care to know." Her voice cut like a blade. "That's the problem, Charles. You never cared to know anything real about anyone. You just needed someone to look down on." She reached down and pulled the diamond ring from her finger. The room collectively held its breath as she set it on the table, with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot. "I can't marry someone who calls a good man a burden. I can't build a life with someone who tears people down to feel tall." "Grace." Charles reached for her arm. She stepped back. "I'm done." She turned and walked down the center aisle, her wedding dress trailing behind her, 250 guests too stunned to move. I heard Margaret's strangled gasp somewhere behind me, her voice starting to rise in protest. At the door, Grace paused and looked back, not at Charles, not at Margaret's horrified face, at me. "Edward," she said quietly. "Leo, come with me." I stood. Leo stood with me. And we walked out together, leaving the wreckage of my brother's perfect day behind us. I drove to the river without thinking. The dock on the edge of Savannah, where I'd spent countless evenings watching the water move slow and steady, asking nothing of me. Leo sat beside me in the truck, silent, his hand still holding mine like he was afraid to let go. We sat on the weathered planks for a long time, feet dangling over the dark water, the sounds of the city distant and unimportant. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if there was anything to say. Then headlights swept across the parking lot behind us. Grace walked down the dock in her wedding dress, the hem dragging through the dirt, her heels in one hand. She didn't speak, just sat down on the other side of Leo and looked out at the river with us. The silence stretched, comfortable, safe. Finally, she turned to Leo. "Your dad's a hero," she said softly. "Don't ever let anyone tell you different." Leo nodded, his throat working. "I know." I exhaled. For the first time in years, I actually exhaled. The next morning, we drove to Charleston to see Marcus. He was 22 now, tall, bright-eyed, studying architecture at a school he'd almost never lived to attend. Grace had told me on the drive that the family moved to Atlanta a few years after the fire, but Marcus had chosen Charleston for college, wanting to build his own path. When he saw me standing in his apartment doorway, he didn't hesitate. He crossed the room and embraced me like a brother, holding on tight. "Thank you," he whispered. "I never got to say it properly. Thank you." I couldn't speak. I just held him back. Leo and Marcus spent the afternoon on the couch, laughing together. Marcus pulled out a box of old comic books, the same ones Leo had brought to the hospital 7 years ago. And they flipped through the pages, trading stories like they'd known each other their whole lives. "You made up the best stories," Marcus told Leo, grinning. "Way better than the real ones." Leo beamed. "I still do that." Watching them, something in my chest finally settled into place. Closure. I didn't know how badly I'd needed it until it was there. 1 year later, everything was different. Word had spread about the wedding, about what Grace had done, about what Charles had said, about the firefighter who'd saved her brother's life. People started calling. Commissions doubled, then tripled. I hired 2 apprentices and moved into a bigger workshop. For the first time in my life, I wasn't surviving. I was building something. Leo thrived. He stood taller now, smiled easier, no longer flinching at the echo of his family's cruelty. He started a marine biology club at school, made friends who saw him the way Grace had always seen him, bright, kind, worth believing in. Grace moved to Savannah permanently. She found a position at a financial firm downtown, but that wasn't why she came. She didn't ask permission. She just showed up one day with boxes and a smile and said, "I found an apartment 3 blocks away. Hope that's okay." It was more than okay. We were a family now, not by ceremony, but by choice. Charles's reputation never recovered. The story spread through every social circle he'd ever cared about, and one by one the doors closed. He left town 6 months later. Margaret stopped calling around the same time. I didn't miss her voice. "Listen, we're almost at the end, and I need to ask you something. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, then share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear that they're not the burden their family says they are. Because stories like Edward's don't go viral on their own. They spread because people like you decide they matter enough to pass along. So be that person. Share this video. You might just save someone's day or their life. On New Year's Eve, we stood on that same dock, me, Leo, and Grace, watching fireworks explode over the Savannah River. The air was cold, but none of us minded. Grace reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a ring, simple gold band, a single sapphire catching the light. "This was my grandmother's," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was supposed to wear it when I got married, but I want you to have it instead." She looked up at me, eyes wet, smiling. "Marry me, Edward." I laughed, really laughed, tears streaming down my face. "Yes." Leo cheered loud enough to scare the birds from the trees, jumping up and down on the old wooden planks. And for the first time in my life, I understood. I was never the burden. I was the one carrying everyone else. Now, finally, someone was carrying me too. Before you go, and I know some of you are about to click away, I need you to do 4 things. First, smash that like button if this story earned it. Second, drop your city in the comments and tell me, have you ever been called a burden by someone who should have loved you? Third, Subscribe if you want more stories about underdogs who finally win. And fourth, this is the most important one, share this video. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear Edward's story. Someone needs to know they're not alone. And you might be the only person who puts it in front of them. Don't rob them of that. Share it right now.